The people who blindly follow trends usually call it confidence, but mature empaths see what most miss. Following the crowd is often just fear wearing a fashionable disguise. And once you understand that, imitation becomes impossible. Most people believe trends are harmless expressions of culture-simple shifts in fashion, language, opinions, or behavior that people naturally adopt because they like them. That is the surface-level explanation, and surface-level explanations are usually where real understanding ends. What few people recognize is that most trends function as silent social compliance tests. They are not just about preference. They are about measuring how strongly a person is wired to seek acceptance through imitation. Human beings are deeply tribal by nature. Long before modern society, survival depended on belonging to the group. Exclusion often meant danger, isolation, even death. That ancient psychological wiring still exists, even though the environment has changed. Today, the threat is rarely physical. It is social. Rejection, invisibility, irrelevance, disapproval, these are the modern forms of exclusion the mind works desperately to avoid. And this is exactly why trends hold so much power over people. They exploit an unconscious fear most individuals never fully examine. The fear that if they do not align with the collective, they will lose connection, status, or belonging. This is why people often adopt behaviors they privately question. They wear things they do not genuinely like, repeat opinions they have not deeply examined, and participate in cultural movements they barely understand. Not because they are convinced, but because non-participation creates discomfort. It forces them to confront the possibility of standing alone. That discomfort is the compliance test. The trend is asking a silent question. How much of your individuality are you willing to trade for social safety? And most people answer without realizing they are being tested. Watch closely in everyday life and the pattern becomes obvious. Someone suddenly changes the way they speak because a certain phrase becomes popular. Entire groups begin expressing identical outrage over issues they had no interest in days earlier. People reshape their identities to fit whatever is currently being rewarded by attention and approval. On the surface, it looks like enthusiasm. Underneath, then, it is often fear disguised as participation. Mature empaths see this immediately because they are trained to read motive beneath behavior. They understand that true self-expression has a completely different energy. It feels grounded, calm, and internally directed. Compliance feels restless. It seeks validation. It watches for approval. It adjusts constantly based on external reaction. This is why emotionally aware people often seem detached from trends. It is not because they reject change or believe they are above others. It is because they can sense the invisible pressure operating beneath the surface. They recognize when something is being followed not because it is meaningful, but because it is socially advantageous. And once you become aware of that pressure, participating blindly becomes almost impossible. You start asking deeper questions. Do I actually believe this? Do I genuinely like this? Or am I responding to the subtle fear of exclusion? That level of self-awareness is deeply uncomfortable because it exposes how much of human behavior is driven by unconscious conformity. The harsh truth is this: most people are not expressing themselves nearly as much as they think. They are performing adaptation for acceptance. And the moment you see trends for what they often are, not expressions of freedom, but tests of submission, you stop following the crowd and start noticing just how desperately the crowd needs to be followed. Most people look at collective behavior and only see the action itself. They see crowds moving in the same direction, sudden waves of agreement, shared outrage, synchronized excitement, or mass enthusiasm, and they assume what they are witnessing is genuine conviction. But emotionally perceptive people understand something far more unsettling. Collective behavior is rarely about the action on the surface. It is about the intention driving it underneath. And intention is where human truth always hides. The average person sees hundreds of people adopting the same opinion, following the same trend, or reacting with the same emotional intensity, and assumes there must be something valid about it simply because so many people are involved. This is one of the oldest psychological traps in human behavior. We are wired to interpret numbers as proof. If enough people are doing something, The brain instinctively reads it as safe, right, or necessary. It is a survival mechanism rooted in ancient tribal psychology. But mature empaths have trained themselves to pause where most people react. They understand that numbers reveal movement, not meaning. What matters is not what the crowd is doing, but why they feel compelled to do it. This is where hidden motives begin to emerge. Look closely enough at collective behavior, and patterns reveal themselves. Sometimes the crowd is driven by the fear of exclusion, irrelevance, or being left behind. Sometimes it is driven by validation, the silent need to be seen participating in whatever is currently being rewarded with attention. Other times it is fueled by emotional contagion, where people absorb the energy of the group without ever questioning whether it reflects their own beliefs. This happens constantly in real life. You see people suddenly becoming passionate about causes they knew nothing about a week earlier. You watch entire social circles adopt identical language, opinions, and emotional reactions as if individual thought has been temporarily suspended. On the surface, it looks like unity. Underneath, it is often psychological alignment for social survival. Mature empaths can feel this instantly. They notice when enthusiasm feels forced, when outrage feels performative, when agreement carries the nervous energy of people seeking approval rather than expressing truth. They understand that real conviction has a different rhythm. It is calm. It does not need constant reinforcement from others. It does not panic when challenged. Performative collective behavior, on the other hand, is fragile. It depends on visibility, repetition, and social reward to sustain itself. The moment they disappear, the behavior often vanishes just as quickly as it arrived. This is why emotionally aware people often appear detached from mass movements. It is not because they reject connection or dismiss community. It is because they have learned to separate shared truth from shared insecurity. They can sense when people are acting from grounded belief and when they are simply moving to avoid the discomfort of standing still while everyone else moves. And that awareness changes everything. Once you begin reading intention instead of imitation, the world becomes impossible to view the same way. You start realizing how much of what appears powerful is actually fragile, how much of what appears confident is rooted in fear. The harsh truth is this: crowds rarely reveal courage. More often, they reveal how terrified people are to think alone. And the moment you learn to see that, the noise of collective behavior loses its power to control you. Most people are so surrounded by noise that they no longer recognize what it is doing to them. They think noise is just sound, constant conversations, endless notifications, opinions flooding every screen, people speaking simply to avoid stillness. But the most dangerous noise is psychological. It is the endless stream of external influence competing for control of your attention, shaping your thoughts before you've had time to examine whether those thoughts are even yours. This is one of the most overlooked truths about human behavior. Clarity does not come from consuming more information. It comes from creating enough silence to hear what remains when influence is removed. And this is exactly why emotionally mature people protect silence so fiercely. They understand that silence is not emptiness. It is exposure. It strips away the emotional static that keeps most people mentally reactive and forces deeper truths to surface. Human beings are naturally uncomfortable with silence because silence removes distraction, and distraction is where most people hide from self-awareness. The moment external stimulation disappears, unresolved thoughts begin to rise. Doubts become louder. Contradictions become harder to ignore. Patterns we've been avoiding suddenly become visible. This is why so many people instinctively fill every quiet moment with scrolling, with meaningless conversation, with background noise, with anything that prevents direct contact with their own internal reality. Silence demands confrontation. It forces a person to sit face to face with what they have been unconsciously avoiding. Mature empaths understand this better than most because they have learned that silence sharpens perception in ways constant stimulation never can. When the noise fades, subtle details become impossible to miss. You start noticing the emotional weight behind someone's words instead of just the words themselves. You recognize inconsistencies in behavior that were once drowned out by distraction. You begin to sense shifts in energy, motive, and intention with startling precision. This is why people who spend time in deliberate silence often appear unusually perceptive. They are not seeing something magical. They are simply seeing what was always there but hidden beneath the chaos. Think about real life. How often do people make impulsive decisions because they reacted inside emotional noise? They answer messages too quickly because silence feels uncomfortable. They follow group opinions because they never pause long enough to think independently. They stay in relationships, routines, or environments that no longer serve them because distraction keeps them from fully feeling what is wrong. Noise accelerates reaction. Silence creates evaluation. And evaluation is where real control begins. This is why emotionally aware people often step back when everyone else rushes forward. They understand that stillness reveals what urgency conceals. While others are swept up in momentum, they withdraw just enough to observe. And in that observation, truth becomes impossible to hide. They can see who is acting from fear, who is performing for approval, who is masking uncertainty with constant motion. The world often mistakes this for detachment or distance. It is neither. It is disciplined. It is the refusal to let external chaos dictate internal clarity. The harsh truth is this. Most people are not confused because life is complicated. They are confused because noise has drowned out their ability to perceive clearly. And the moment you become comfortable enough to sit in silence, you begin hearing the truths that noise was designed to keep you from noticing. Most people think following is harmless. They tell themselves they are simply adapting, staying informed, keeping up, fitting into the rhythm of the world around them. It feels practical. It feels normal. What they rarely stop to consider is what they quietly surrender every time they follow without question. Because influence is not only about controlling others. Real influence begins with controlling the direction of your own mind. And the moment your choices become automatic responses to external pressure, attention, or social momentum, that control begins to slip away. This is one of the deepest hidden truths about human behavior. Every act of unconscious conformity trains the mind to seek direction outside itself. At first, it seems insignificant. A shift in opinion because everyone around you agrees. A change in behavior because resistance feels inconvenient. Adopting a perspective not because it feels true, but because it feels safer than standing apart. These moments seem small, almost invisible, but repeated enough, they create something powerful: psychological dependency on external cues. The brain begins outsourcing judgment. Instead of asking, "What do I actually think?" it starts asking, "What is everyone else doing?" That shift is subtle, but it changes everything. Because once a person loses the habit of independent evaluation, they become highly influenceable without ever realizing it. This is how control often works in modern life. It rarely arrives through force. It arrives through repetition, normalization, and social reinforcement. The most effective influence does not demand obedience. It makes obedience feel voluntary. Look closely, and you can see this everywhere. Entire groups adopt identical beliefs, language, preferences, and reactions within remarkably short periods of time. They believe they are expressing themselves when in reality they are responding to invisible social pressure. What feels like personal choice is often collective conditioning. Mature empaths recognize this instantly because they understand that true autonomy has a very different emotional texture. It feels grounded, deliberate, and calm. It does not need constant validation from the crowd. Following, on the other hand, often carries subtle anxiety. There is a quiet urgency beneath it, the fear of being left behind, excluded, misunderstood, or unseen. That fear is what makes surrender so easy. People do not usually give away influence because they are weak. They give it away because belonging feels safer than uncertainty. But emotionally aware people understand something most never fully grasp. Every time you silence your own perception to align with external momentum, you weaken your ability to lead your own life. Influence is not something granted by popularity or status. It is built through internal authority, the ability to think clearly even when the crowd is moving in another direction. This is why mature empaths often seem resistant to trends, pressure, or mass agreement. It is not rebellion for its own sake. It is self-preservation. They know that the easiest way to lose control is to become comfortable borrowing other people's certainty. And once that happens, your thoughts stop being entirely your own. The harsh truth is this. Most people believe they are following because they choose to. In reality, they are following because they have forgotten how to stand still long enough to decide for themselves. And the moment you realize that, you begin to understand that every unconscious act of following is not just imitation, it is a quiet surrender of your power to lead yourself. Most people spend their lives chasing recognition without ever realizing what they are actually seeking. They tell themselves they want success, respect, attention, admiration, visibility. But beneath all of those desires is something far more primitive and far more revealing: the need to feel confirmed by something outside themselves. This is one of the deepest psychological dependencies in human behavior. External recognition gives temporary relief from internal uncertainty. A compliment quiets self-doubt for a moment. Approval creates a brief illusion of worth. Attention feels like proof of significance. And because that relief feels real, people begin structuring their lives around getting more of it. They adjust their words to be more accepted. They shape their image to be more admired. They pursue what is visible rather than what is meaningful. What makes this so dangerous is how socially rewarded it appears. The world often celebrates people who know how to attract attention, but rarely questions what that pursuit is costing them internally. Mature empaths understand something most people spend years avoiding. If your sense of value depends on external response, then your emotional stability is permanently in someone else's hands. This is the hidden trap of external validation. It creates invisible dependence. The moment your peace relies on how others perceive you, your behavior begins shifting in ways you may not even notice. You become more cautious, more performative, more willing to suppress what is authentic if authenticity risks disapproval. You stop asking, "Is this true to who I am?" and start asking, "How will this be received?" That single shift quietly changes the entire structure of your decisions. And this happens constantly in real life. You see people staying silent when they disagree because speaking honestly might cost acceptance. You see people curating versions of themselves they barely recognize because those versions are essentially easier to praise. You see people pursuing relationships, careers, lifestyles, even beliefs they never deeply wanted simply because those things signal status or approval. On the surface, it looks like ambition. Underneath, it is often fear of being unseen, unapproved, or emotionally unsupported. Mature empaths eventually see through this, usually because they have lived it themselves. They know what it feels like to overextend, to seek affirmation through being needed, admired, or understood. But at some point, something shifts. They realize that no amount of external recognition can permanently resolve internal disconnection. The praise fades, the approval changes, the attention moves elsewhere. And if self-worth was built on those things, it collapses the moment they disappear. This is why emotionally mature people begin turning inward for validation. Not out of arrogance, but out of necessity. They learn to measure themselves by alignment instead of applause. They ask whether their choices reflect truth, not popularity. They understand that internal validation creates a kind of psychological freedom most people never experience. When your worth is self-defined, manipulation offers its power. Rejection loses its sting. Approval becomes pleasant, but no longer necessary. And that level of emotional independence is deeply unsettling to those who still depend on external confirmation because it cannot be controlled. The harsh truth is this: the more desperately someone needs to be recognized, the easier they are to influence. But the moment you no longer require the world to validate your existence, you are free to exist. You become something very rare, someone whose peace cannot be negotiated, purchased, or taken away. Most people are taught to believe that visibility is power. From an early age, they absorb the idea that the more attention you attract, the more influence you possess. Popularity becomes confused with significance. Being noticed becomes mistaken for being respected. And because of this, Countless people spend their lives chasing visibility, shaping themselves into whatever version will gain the quickest approval. They adjust their opinions to match the room, soften their truth to avoid resistance, and perform versions of themselves designed to be easily accepted. On the surface, this looks like confidence. But beneath it often lives something much quieter and far less stable: the fear that without constant recognition they might disappear. This is the hidden weakness of popularity. It depends entirely on external maintenance. It survives only as long as it continues to satisfy the expectations of others. The moment it no longer does, it begins to fade. Mature empaths understand this at a level most people never stop to examine. They know that attention can be manufactured, applause can be manipulated, and approval can be temporary. What cannot be easily manufactured is authenticity. And that is precisely why authenticity carries a kind of psychological power popularity can never replicate. Authenticity has weight. It has stability. It creates trust because it feels internally anchored rather than externally adjusted. Human beings are far more perceptive than they often appear. Even when people cannot consciously explain it, they can feel the difference between someone who is presenting themselves for approval and someone who is simply being who they are. One creates momentary attraction. The other creates lasting impact. Think about the people who leave the deepest impression on you. They are rarely the loudest in the room. They are often calmest. The ones who speak without needing to impress. The ones who hold their ground without demanding validation. The ones whose presence feels steady because it is not shifting to match the environment. This is because authenticity creates psychological certainty. It signals that a person is not negotiating their identity based on reaction. And that kind of internal consistency is deeply compelling. It commands respect because it cannot be easily influenced. Popularity, by contrast, often carries an invisible desperation. It seeks constant feedback. It watches for approval. It adapts too quickly. It bends under pressure because its survival depends on staying desirable to the crowd. Mature empaths see this clearly. They understand that what is widely admired is not always deeply valued. In fact, the more someone chases universal approval, the more diluted their presence often becomes. This is the paradox most people miss. The desperate pursuit of being liked often makes a person less impactful, not more. Real power comes from being willing to remain fully yourself, even when that means not everyone understands, agrees, or applauds. That willingness creates a quiet authority no performance can imitate. It unsettles people because it exposes how much of social behavior is built on adjustment for acceptance. The harsh truth is this: popularity can make people notice you, but authenticity makes them remember you. One depends on the crowd's attention. The other creates a presence so grounded, it changes the emotional atmosphere of the room without ever needing to ask for it. And in the end, the people who command the most lasting power are rarely the ones who were most visible. They are the ones who were real enough that pretending around them became impossible.